Lord, you are blind.
I'd like to begin this evening by thanking the Cleveland chapter of the Names Project for... What? Is that better? I'll start over. I want to begin by thanking the Cleveland chapter of the Names Project for providing 32 panels of the over 11,000 panels of the quilt. As many of you know, it now covers over 9 acres when it is fully spread out. Half of the panels before you have just been made recently here in northeastern Ohio. They are from Cleveland and Lorain County. I promised Larry a short introduction, but I may have trouble keeping my promise. Before I begin, I want to introduce the other person on the stage. This is Peter Staley. He's also a member of ACT UP. He's an Oberlin College graduate, 1983, and he's going to be speaking after Larry in Wilder 110 on some aspects of ACT UP and activism. So this is not the last thing in the evening. There are many Kramers to introduce. The screenwriter and producer with 4 Oscar nominations for Women in Love, and more recently his work Hurricane. The author of the best-selling novel Faggots. The playwright, author of the acclaimed The Normal Heart, scenes from which we saw last night. And more recently, Just Say No and The Furniture of Home. He's been described as a prophet and as America's most valuable troublemaker. More directly, tonight he speaks as the major gay political writer of the last decade, whose words, ideas, and passion about the AIDS epidemic have galvanized many to action and have led to the formation of 2 major gay and lesbian organizations for coping with the epidemic. The Gay Men's Health Crisis, which is an AIDS service organization, and more recently, ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. The early months of the AIDS epidemic were ones of great fear and confusion among gay men. Larry's political writing, for instance, the very influential article 1112 and Counting, and his political organizing, the GMHC, provided ways of thinking about and actively resisting and coping with the disease. More recently, as it became very clear that the government was not willing, I'm putting this politely, was not willing to commit support, resources, or even words, his words again galvanized the formation of ACT UP, without doubt the most influential direct action civil disobedience organization around, which has been concerned with fighting the epidemic. He has brought us hope, vision, and he's tried to bring us our marching orders. Tonight he will bring us another, to use the name of his book, Report from the Holocaust. Join me in welcoming Larry Kramer.
I'm just so overwhelmed. There's so many of you here tonight. Peter said, do you think we're finally getting the message out? And you certainly do attest to it. You've made us both feel so very special. These couple of days in Oberlin, they will be among the most memorable in my life. I cannot tell you what it means to see so many of you responding. And I want to thank particularly the kids who worked so hard to publicize this. I've never seen so many posters around. On sidewalks, on rocks. on my pillow at night before I went to sleep. And Joe Keenan and Noel Martin and Dan Goldberg, thank you all very much. I didn't basically want to come here, and Joe just kept pestering me, and I'm so glad that I did. I feel very uncomfortable speaking in front of this quilt. I have very mixed feelings about it. Initially, when my friend Cleve Jones in San Francisco put it together, I, like everyone else, wept. I'm just tired of seeing it and what it stands for, both metaphorically and actually. It means to me that it was the consummate metaphor for how we grieve quietly. And we must not grieve quietly. That's what ACT UP is all about. I am 54 years old. When I first started AIDS, fighting AIDS, I was 44 years old. I don't feel 54 years old. I feel not much older than you. That happens to some people if they're lucky and as they grow older, that they somehow stay young inside. But I know I must look ancient to you. And yes, I have seen so much that you haven't seen, that I am old in many ways that you yet can't be. I have discovered, and this only over the past 10 years, that the world is not a very nice place, and that people, all people, are often not very nice people. And this has not been a very nice lesson to learn, and perhaps not one that should be presented to you, you who are full of hope and just starting out in the world and on the journey that I started out when I left Yale in 1957, before any of you were even born. Yes, that makes me feel very old, knowing that I can never again be so young and so full of hope as you are now. I hope you are full of hope and will remain so, even after what I tell you, because hope is the only thing that keeps us alive. And yes, believe it or not, and despite everything I know and everything I have been through and learned these past 10 years, I do still have hope. Even though, as I want to talk to you about tonight, the world has lost the war against AIDS. AIDS has won. I'm going to put all my statistics up front, give them to you now, and try not to give you any more. I've learned that statistics can be made to lie any which way you want them to. And I, like the government, have certainly learned how to use them in my own way. Larry facts, some of my obsessively knowledgeable friends in ACT UP call them. But what I am going to give you are a few statistics that can't lie for anybody. There is one new HIV infection in the United States every single minute. There are 212 new cases of AIDS every day. There is one AIDS death every 12 minutes. At least 4 in every 1,000 college kids is now HIV positive. That means that at least 4 of you who are here tonight are now infected. Don't feel safe. Please, the other 996 of you, don't feel safe. The incubation period of AIDS, of the AIDS virus, is very, very slow. When I first started hearing about AIDS and fighting about it, there were only 41 cases. When I first started really getting scared and vocal, there were 1,000. Now there are over 100,000, with anywhere from 1 to 4 million infected. Nobody knows how many, and nobody knows really how to count them. And the fastest rising risk group in the major cities is now heterosexual women, often with no connection to any of the other risk groups. In New York City, the percentage of straight women coming down with AIDS has risen from 3% to 7%. I said I wasn't going to give you another statistic, and there's another statistic. These first 100,000 cases took 9 years. It's estimated that the next 100,000 are going to come in the next 2 years. And if a healthcare system is collapsing under the weight of a first 100,000, it is terrible to consider what another 100,000 are going to do so quickly. The Centers for Disease Control, which keeps the tallies, relies on doctors reporting all their cases to them. We're finding out now that most doctors don't report cases to the CDC for various reasons. To protect patients, to protect their own practices, most often just because they're too busy. So all the figures that were always going on are very low. I have called my talk, "We Have Lost the War Against AIDS." AIDS started out as a disease, then it became an epidemic, then it became a pandemic, now it is a plague. It is a plague, an epidemic, a pandemic that need not have happened. It was obvious to enough people from the very beginning what would happen unless precautions were taken. But because AIDS was happening mostly to gay men, the forces of bigotry were not powerful enough. Oh my goodness, I'm reading badly here. The forces of bigotry were powerful enough to prevent such measures from being taken, and indeed are still fighting powerfully to prevent such measures from being taken. AIDS has taught 25 million gay sons and daughters a very scary lesson. The parents of 25 million gay sons and daughters don't want to take care of their children when many of them are ill. In fact, this country will do almost anything rather than pay attention to AIDS. It will not educate or support adequate funding for research and treatment. It will not do anything about lessening the cost of what meager treatments there are, which are so expensive that most of those with AIDS can't afford them. And it will not exert pressure on the second president in a row who pretends that AIDS, 10 years into a plague, isn't even here and refuses to put someone with brains in charge of it. Can you imagine a plague is raging here and there was no one in charge of it? Can you imagine parents killing their own kids? Can you imagine in time of plague that there is only minimum, sporadic, uncoordinated research conducted by second-rate yo-yos, for the most part, or unbelievably not even conducted at all? Can you imagine that life-saving drugs, some of these drugs even owned by your own government, therefore by us, are priced so high that most of those who desperately need them can't afford them? Can you imagine that there is no endorsement of any kind of full-scale education, of safe sex guidelines, the use of condoms? Can you imagine that the second compassionless president in a row, and I don't care what he says in public, refuses to put anyone in charge, as he did immediately for scandals involving illegal drugs, HUD, savings and loan? He has appointed another in a long line of useless secretaries of Health and Human Services, Dr. Sullivan. He has appointed a compliant Surgeon General after getting rid of a good one, Dr. Koop. He has removed the head of the Food and Drug Administration just when, miracle of miracles, he was beginning to do something right. He hasn't even appointed a director of the National Institutes of Health. And one of the top AIDS experts in the world, Dr. Samuel Broder of the National Cancer Institute, has said publicly that he believes AIDS can be cured. Can you imagine that a man of his repute can say this publicly, and that every impediment imaginable is being placed in the way of our receiving this cure? Why? We know the usual reasons. Because AIDS is still thought of as a gay disease, even though it remains predominantly heterosexual in Africa, and even though straight cases are rising in this country. It has served the conservative, right-wing agendas in America to maintain that AIDS is a gay disease. And faggots are this era's niggers and kikes, an officially sanctioned scapegoat to sow hatred seems historically always to be necessary in this country and this world. Since it's now illegal to discriminate against Jews and blacks, it's still perfectly okay to go after the queers. Gays keep congressional bigots inordinately busy. Senator Gordon Humphrey offered amendments 2 years in a row denying federal health care funds to any organization that used the terms normal, natural, or healthy to describe homosexuality. Senator Armstrong offered a broad amendment to the American with Disabilities Act, which protects people with AIDS, to remove protection for gays, whether they had AIDS or not. The inhuman monster, Jesse Helms, got an amendment passed that would have required that safe sex materials not promote or encourage homosexuality. Way to stop a plague, America. Thanks, Mom and Dad. And I don't have to tell you what's happening in your own state, in a town called Cincinnati. And not so far from here at 7 p.m. on Wednesday, last November 15th, in Springfield, Missouri, while leading a candlelight vigil at Southwest Missouri State University in support of my play, The Normal Heart, a young student organizer, someone just like you, had the house where he lived in burned down by local bigots. Springfield is the home of the Assemblies of God Church, a fundamentalist religion. The Normal Heart is about how and why AIDS was ignored from day one. It shows two men kissing. It shows two men getting married. It shows one person losing the person he loved most in the world. In 5 years, and many hundreds of productions, in Soviet Russia, in Poland, in Israel, in Catholic Ireland, there has never been one single incident against the Normal Heart. But in our own wonderful country, a Missouri state representative named Gene Dixon used the same argument Jesse Helms used to remove the exhibition at the Corcoran Gallery in Washington of work, of course, by the gay photographer Robert Mapplethorpe. The same Robert Mapplethorpe who was causing such a fuss in Cincinnati. This argument being that taxpayers' money must not be used to promote homosexuality. When told about the fire, Gene Dixon professed sadness, but claimed that the student leader, Brad Davis, someone just like you, was a Satan worshiper. She then insisted on studying the bodies of his 2 cats, which had been killed in the fire, and then proclaimed to the press that she thought Brad Davis was into animal sacrifice as well. There are 25 million gay people in the United States. That is no small number of taxpayers. Therefore, 25 million gay men and lesbians have every right to see our lives dramatized, photographed, painted, filmed, exhibited, read about, promoted, and protected. We have a right to be taken care of when we are ill, just like straight, white, heterosexual, middle-class males, the ruling class in this country. Indeed, the American Revolution was fought by citizens over just this issue, taxation without representation. So let's not talk about the right of taxpayers to determine how their money is spent, as Representative Pat Williams of Montana did, referring to heterosexual taxpayers. And let's not take any more polls about whether taxpayers or editors of Newsweek or viewers of Entertainment Tonight approve of gays. It's illegal to take polls about whether people like Jews or blacks. And if these polls were taken, Jews and blacks would lose. And let's not trot out that old chestnut, gays are abnormal. 25 million is too large a number of folks to be caused by anything but normal statistical differences. Homosexuals can change, Representative William Dannemeyer said in a recent book. We can't and we don't want to if we could. A black kid is murdered in Bensonhurst. A Jewish kid gets mauled in Brooklyn. 14 school kids are killed in upstate New York in a tornado, and the law and the media are there in droves in a minute. Gays are murdered regularly, and no one is there at all. The FBI in Missouri has refused to investigate who burned down Brad Evans' house. No reporter has ever asked Reagan or Bush a question about AIDS at a presidential news conference. Way to stop a plague, America. Thanks, Mom and Dad. I seem to have spent a lot of time talking about hate and discrimination rather than about AIDS. But then it has taken me 10 years to realize that AIDS in every possible way is a metaphor for hate. The hatred of the ruling class for the minority. And this minority now includes not only gays, but Hispanics and Africans and Afro-Americans and women and children and people who take drugs and men and women who prefer not to get married and women who find themselves selling their bodies for money. Somehow this mixed salad of people find themselves tossed together, and instead of being heralded, as this country and its presidents are always so proud of proclaiming, as part of the big, wonderful melting pot that makes America brave and great and strong and true, we are now relegated to that now hateful category, minority, the expendable ones, the ones who can be left to die. For make no mistake, I now know that intentional genocide is going on. Otherwise, so many people would not be left to die. Otherwise, the leader of a country in time of plague would put somebody in charge of it. You think there is research going on in Washington toward finding a cure? You are wrong. There is $1 billion being pissed down the toilet at the National Institutes of Health, where there is also no one in charge, and where there are so many committees and committees within committees and peer reviews that it is truly impossible and unnecessary for anyone ever to have to make a decision. Can you imagine a system so set up that it is not necessary for anyone to make a decision? That is what has happened to government in our country. And that is how the Holocaust, the big one, of Jews and gays and gypsies, in Europe during World War II. That is how the big Holocaust was allowed to happen. Good men and women just doing their jobs, good family men who had families to protect and who were part of huge bureaucracies that were only following orders from someone higher up. The great philosopher Hannah Arendt, and I hope you are studying her and reading her and revering her, has written about this, most specifically in her book Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. In America, yet another Holocaust is going on. Good men and women, good family men who have families to protect and who are part of huge bureaucracies are keeping their jobs by doing or not doing what their superiors are instructing. And the superior at the top, the president, is telling them nothing. So it is nothing that is being done, even though these good family men and women know that more and more people are coming down with AIDS and dying from AIDS. This is how Hitler's henchmen followed his orders. You think I'm crazy? This is how John Poindexter followed Ronald Reagan's orders. By now, you think this is sounding far-fetched, and I'm going crazy comparing our presidents to Hitler. I beg you to locate another book in addition to books by Hannah Arendt. And this one is called Modernity in the Holocaust. It has just been called to my attention by Simon Watney, the great English AIDS activist. It is by Professor Zygmunt Bauman, a professor at the University of Leeds, and it is published in this country by Cornell University Press. This is the first full academic explication of a theory that I have held for a long time and wrote about in my own book, Reports from the Holocaust. Bauman takes my theory one step further. He maintains, God help us all, that in the modern world, Holocausts are inevitable. That modernity, the progressive triumph of modern civilization, the determination by some to create more perfect worlds, has brought with it a system of bureaucracy that results in calculated exercises of bureaucratic moral indifference that can be generated on a massive scale. Bureaucracy, of course, does not reward competence and originality. It rewards compliance. Bauman's conclusion, and he uses the terms and methods of his chosen field of sociology, is that society now functions to render moral norms inoperative rather than to enforce them. For that is what has happened. A society which hates gays has allowed them to become this decade's Jews. And just as Jews were joined in extermination by others who were not Jewish, so gays are now joined by many, many others who are not gays. And yet there is no condemnation of this happening. Morality and moral norms are not operating. Just as the world sat by while millions of Jews and others were murdered, so this same world is sitting by as millions of gays and others are murdered. Let me illustrate. 3 years ago, almost 4, before ACT UP was founded, it was discovered that government research, despite the appropriation by Congress of sufficient funds, was not going on. I decided I had to go to Washington and try to unravel the trail that led from the White House to the various agencies. I had naively believed that just because the money we had fought for so desperately for so many years had been appropriated, that something would be done with it. We found out that it wasn't, that the system of official AIDS treatment centers the NIH had set up was receiving millions of dollars, 47 million at the time ACT UP was founded. It's now received over $1 billion. And that these treatment centers had nothing but vacancies. Hospitals that were supposed to be treating 2,000 people were treating 10. I'm not exaggerating. Hospitals like Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York were receiving $1 million each and every year for treating 10 people in a program that was funded for 2,000. I had believed that NIH would be spending this money. For 3 precious years, I and others had sat by and waited for the results, thinking they were doing their work. How many dear friends died while I and others sat by so lazily, not paying any attention, not having the energy or courage to get on the phone and inquire politely, "Please, sirs, can you tell me what you're doing with all that nice money that Congress gave to you?" How could we have been so lazy and irresponsible and trusting? Where were we all? Where were all our AIDS and gay organizations? Where were our people in Washington? Where was I? For I blame myself more than I blame anyone else. I had trusted too. My first meeting on that trip was at the White House. It is a very moving, awe-inspiring experience approaching, going into the White House for the first time in your life. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and my father worked for the government, and I know what it's like to be passing that building and never being allowed in. But I had an appointment that had been set up for me by a congressman. And that appointment was with a man called Gary Bauer, who was the President Reagan's domestic policy advisor in charge of AIDS. He was, physically as well as emotionally and mentally, a very, very creepy man. He had bulging eyes. He looked like something that Kafka would write about. We laugh, but this is the man who was in charge of AIDS. I asked him if ignoring AIDS was intentional, and he answered that he had not seen enough evidence, these were his words, that the Black Plague was going on. He was particularly interested to hear from me that current evidence indicated that the gay male population of the major cities was on its way to becoming totally exposed to the virus. He asked me if I thought if female-to-male transmission was as potent as male-to-male, and I answered that the statistics were about the same. He argued with me and said that his advisors told him otherwise, that male-to-male was far more effective. I asked him why the president had refused to put anyone in charge, to appoint an AIDS czar. He told me the president was the AIDS czar. I asked him why the president had not only not read the Surgeon General Koop's report on AIDS, a very damning document, or the National Academy of Sciences AIDS report, a second very damning document, both of which were then almost a year old, and both of which begged, implored for immediate all-out action. We're talking now about 1986. And Gary Bauer responded that the chain of command dictates that in matters of health, the President talked only to his Secretary of Health and Human Services, Dr. Otis R. Bowen. Bauer referred to AZT as ACT. It was perfectly obvious that he loathed homosexuals. And now, indeed, for those of you who may watch Sunday morning talk shows from Washington, Gary Bauer appears quite frequently as the spokesperson for some national association fighting for family values, and he appears quite regularly as a hate monger against gays. His language is now no longer so carefully couched. And this was Ronald Reagan's AIDS advisor to a president whom we now know was ruled by his advisors. You think it might be different now. Last December, George and Barbara Bush visited the NIH and talked privately with several AIDS patients. One of them wrote up his impressions of the meeting for a gay paper. The patient said that he was appalled at how little the president knew about AIDS or knew about gay people. He said it was like talking to someone from a foreign country who didn't speak the language. Back to my journey through the bureaucratic labyrinth. Dr. Bowen, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, wouldn't see me. He was Reagan's third Secretary of HHS, and he was supposed to be in charge of all AIDS. During his entire term of office, he was never heard to say publicly one thing about AIDS. The secretary of the main department of your government in charge of AIDS, the one single man who can report to the president on the state of this nation's health, had never been heard to say anything about AIDS. And this was the beginning of the 7th year of the plague. There is now no question in my mind that Gary Bauer, who ruled Bowen as Poindexter ruled his Ollie North and others, and as both of them probably never bothered to tell the president anything, feeling in their heart of hearts that they were performing acts the president would approve of anyway, that Bauer made it clear to Bowen that AIDS was not a top priority to be discussed. You think it is different now. The new Secretary of Health and Human Services, Dr. Louis Sullivan, has been heard to say precious little about AIDS either. The Bush cabinet is much better on rhetoric than the Reagan cabinet, but just as do-nothing behind the words. Dr. Sullivan has been surrounded by a staff of protective right-wingers. Of all places in the cabinet, HHS is one of the most tricky, for that is where abortion is dealt with. And Dr. Sullivan put his foot in his mouth, if you remember, very early on by favoring abortion and then backtracking, being forced to backtrack. This so terrified the White House that they surrounded him with a staff so conservative that AIDS is never spoken of either. Dr. Sullivan is not a free man. He is in a prison. He is not free to speak. And I have this on very good authority, for an old lover of mine is on staff there. I was allowed to meet with the Assistant Secretary of HHS under Reagan. His name was Dr. Robert Windham. Dr. Robert Windham had never worked in government before. He was a private physician from Sarasota who got his job in Washington for one reason only. He had given $55,000 to Reagan's campaign. He was described to me this way by a top legislative congressional aide. If his IQ were any lower, you'd have to water him. You laugh, but Dr. Windham was in charge of our lives. An uncaring, dumb stooge who knew next to nothing about AIDS was in charge of my life and by inference in charge of your lives too. Particularly the 5 or 6 or 7 of you in this room who are already HIV positive. Dr. Wyndham reported to Dr. Bowen. Dr. Bowen reported to Gary Bauer. Gary Bauer reported to the president. Dr. Wyndham had an assistant named Dr. Harmison, who also wouldn't see me. Dr. Harmison, it was well known, did not like gays. My gay congressional contacts, and we have many gay people on the Hill, described Dr. Harmison to me as evil. You cannot say enough bad things about Lowell Harmison, I was told by more than one. His biggest paranoid fear was that gays would intentionally give blood on purpose in order to pollute the nation's blood supply. Dr. Harmon reported to Dr. Wyndham, who reported to Dr. Bowen, who reported to Gary Bauer, who reported to the president. Bauer, Bowen, Wyndham, Harmison, these were the 4 top men in charge of AIDS in the US government. The government of all the American people. 2 bigots, 1 not very smart man, and 1 coward. And I knew more about AIDS than any of them. Indeed, any one of you here who reads the newspapers and watches TV shows knows more about AIDS than any one of these 4 monsters. Next, I went to the National Institutes of Health. The NIH receives $7 billion each and every year to look after the health of the American people. Their charter reads, quote, to improve the health of the American people. The then head of the NIH was a man named Dr. James Weingarten. In his entire tenure, Dr. Weingarten never said anything about AIDS. The biggest plague of modern times, a transmissible virus now infecting a new person every single minute, and he never said a word about it. You think it's different now? Now there's not even a director at the NIH. Nobody. Dr. Weingarten reported to Dr. Wyndham, who reported to Dr. Bowen, who reported to Dr. Gary Bauer, who reported to President Reagan. The NIH looks like a college campus, like this one. It's really made up of 12 institutes, which are sort of like dorms or frat or sorority houses, all part of the whole. 10 years ago, when AIDS was first noticed, and you would have thought NIH would jump on it fast, this is what happened. You would have thought that because there was a cancer involved called Kaposi sarcoma, it should have gone to the institute in charge of cancer, called the National Cancer Institute. The NCI is the richest fraternity at NIH. In 1981, when AIDS was first showed up, it should have gone to this rich fraternity. But the head of the fraternity didn't want it, so he blackballed it. He had $1 billion of research money to improve the health of the American people, and this man, whose name was Dr. Vincent T. DeVita, we should remember these casts of characters, because someday, someone is going to come up with the expose, like the Iran-Contras. And these names will suddenly ring out like that cast of characters now. Dr. Vincent D. DeVita, who was head of the National Cancer Institute, who resigned in 1987 to take a top job running Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York at a reported $400,000 a year. That's the kind of money you can jump to from a government if you are a good bureaucrat who is compliant and obeys. He didn't want, DeVita knew AIDS was a smelly political hot potato. And so he passed the buck to a poor relation, a much smaller institute, named the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, NIAID, which had a budget only 1/4 and was not nearly so popular a fraternity to rush, and was then run by a man named Dr. Richard Krause, who was a closeted gay man, and so terrified of being discovered to be gay that rather than deal with AIDS, he quit. He was replaced by the man who is in charge now, the man who probably has more to say about AIDS in my life and the lives of all of you who are in danger than any single one person in the entire world. His name, in case you didn't know it, is Dr. Anthony Fauci. At that time, Dr. Fauci reported to Dr. Weingarten, who reported to Dr. Windham, who reported to Dr. Bowen, who reported to Gary Bauer, who reported to President Reagan. And believe me when I tell you that this chain of command is rigidly obeyed. Now Dr. Fauci reports to Dr. Mason, who reports to Dr. Sullivan, who reports to Dr. Lee, who reports to Bush. Dr. Mason is a Mormon. He took Dr. Windham's place. He is a Mormon, a religion that particularly hates gays. And Dr. Sullivan is surrounded by his conservative right-wing staff, and the president is still not being informed. Can you see what Hannah Arendt and Professor Zygmunt Bauman mean when they talk about the banality of evil, of how holocausts can happen and are bound to happen in this modern bureaucratic world? All it takes is one person somewhere high up in the chain of command who hates, and everything else just falls into line along the rest of the way. Professor Bauman puts it very bluntly. When the modernist dream of creating the perfect society, which of course is a racist concept, is embraced by an absolute power, and although he was talking about Hitler, make no mistake that Reagan and Bush operate effectively under absolute power, and is able to monopolize modern vehicles of rational action, the press, public opinion, and when that power attains freedom from effective social control, a weak media, or one controlled by conservative forces as ours, and the non-interference, the passive acceptance of those things by the population at large, genocide follows. All of these factors and forces are fully normal, in quotes. They are constantly present in every modern society, and their presence has been made both possible and inescapable by those processes which are properly associated with the rise and entrenchment of modern civilization. I find that I just was sent this book a week ago, and I even haven't finished it. And I read this particular sentence that I just read to you 2 nights ago. And I began to shake because he is talking about the Holocaust, the Hitler Holocaust. And as I'm reading this, I am seeing all of these faces, Gary Bauer and Robert Windham and Tony Fauci, and I am seeing all of these people and fitting them in, and the same theory is holding forth. Nobody here is really saying, go out and kill the faggots and the niggers and the spics and the junkies and the whores and the illegitimate kids and the unmarried mothers. But in fact, that's just what they are all saying, and just what is really happening. From Hitler to Roosevelt, to Reagan, to Bush, nothing is very different. And I say Roosevelt because this afternoon as I was walking across the campus, I remember 2 books that I read. I went over to see if I could find them to find the guy's name, but I couldn't. One book is called The Abandonment of the Jews by David Wyman, and the other is called While 6 Million Died by Arthur Morse. And both of these books documented that there was in the White House a man who was in charge of the Jewish question. And he was a Gentile who was anti-Semitic and hated Jews, and saw to it that most of the papers and the letters of imprecation that came from around the world never got to Roosevelt's desk. And he had a name, and that was the name I was going to try and find for you today. So what do? Lie down and die? Many people do. Most people do. It's very hard for minorities to organize. They have enough trouble existing in this world as it is. Many of them are very poor. A lot of them don't speak English. Most of them are, in one way or another, afraid. Life is very terrifying for very many people. That's why it's so easy to kill so many of us off. That's why it's so easy to evict them, or cut benefits, or eliminate social programs, and cut, and trim. Most people are afraid to fight back. Most people don't like to make waves. Most people don't understand that they have power. The Constitution gave them power. It always amazes me when I tell people they have power. And they answer me, power, me, what power? Your voice is your power, your collective voices, your group power. Names all strung together on membership lists are power. Think of the National Rifle Association. Bodies all strung together in a line are power. Think of the anti-war movement, the time of Vietnam. I know it's not easy, that it's harder than ever. The fight against the entrenched by the dispossessed is never-ending and exhausting. Shortly after I came back from that fateful, awful trip to Washington, ACT UP was formed. And we have bodies all strung together in a line, and we have loud, angry, obnoxious voices. And in 3 years, we have achieved considerable power. I also know that many of us are extremely tired, and that more and more of us are getting sick and dying faster than we can replenish our ranks. I fear very much that our movement may not continue to grow. I also know that in New York City now you cannot get into hospitals and emergency rooms, and that dead bodies are now literally found in doorways. I used to think that ACT UP could save the world, that if there were an ACT UP in every city and on every college campus, the system would have no choice but to respond. It was in such a similar fashion that this country was extricated from the Vietnam War by a growing grassroots movement that grew and grew. I see ACT UP growing, but I see AIDS growing faster. There are already more people dead from AIDS than died in Vietnam. You are all so young still. And though I feel young and not much older than you, I know I am, and I know my body is now infected with HIV, and my dreams are nightmares that I didn't have when I was your age. I know I am very tired, and I know that my fellow fighters in ACT UP chapters around the world are tired, and I fear for the future of millions and millions of people, unless by some miracle in some laboratory, and I will wager it will not be an American one, a cure is discovered soon. I don't know what it takes anymore to rouse people to this fight, to realize that it is the most important fight in the world today, that you must put aside other fights which perhaps appeal to you, fights for civil rights and equal opportunity and pro-choice and anti-smoking, whatever is important to you. I ask you to fight for that and AIDS. For a transmissible virus is going around, And the concept of that simply continues to escape this world. A transmissible virus is going around, and nothing is stopping it. And as I have talked to you, some 60 new people have become infected, and some 5 people have died, and 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 of these new infections are in college students, young women and men, just like you, perhaps you. I wonder if you can put yourself in the place of my young friend Mike, who was just 1 or 2 years older than you are, who graduated just a year or so ago from Ohio State. He is smart, very, very bright, and very handsome. Everything in the world to live for. He graduated and went out into the world filled with hope and enthusiasm and energy. He came to New York, to Columbia University, and he fell in love with another smart and enterprising and handsome young man. And knowing about AIDS, they decided to live with each other and be faithful to each other. They set up house with each other, like people in love want to do, and often do. And then Mike's lover came down with AIDS, because no one is safe now. No one who has had sex in the past 10 or 15 years. This is a very slow virus, which often hides for a very long time. Mike took care of his lover devotedly, hoping against hope that someone might know more today than 10 years ago, and that he might survive, and their relationship survive. But his lover got very, very sick. He couldn't seem to get any better. He got worse and worse. And when they thought it could not get any worse, it got worse. This is a horrible illness, wasting, wretched, painful, ghastly to watch and witness and endure. And expensive, so expensive, with the medicines one must have costing thousands and thousands of dollars, and insurance only paying part or not any at all, because treatments are experimental and not improved yet by that slow process in Washington that must approve everything before an insurance company is forced to pay. 2 young men, just like you, just starting out on life, cannot afford to risk, cannot afford to be sick from AIDS. One night, Mike came home and found his lover had taken an overdose and had left a note saying goodbye. Mike ran to his body and realized that he was still breathing, that he was still alive. And then began the most torturous moments of Mike's life. Should he let him die? Should he call emergency and try and save him? Save him for what? For more of this awful, hateful, wasting, wretched illness? Let him die, one voice said. But what if he got better? What if a new drug comes along tomorrow, in the next few months? Save him, another voice said. Oh yes, save him, because this is the man I love and the man I want to spend the rest of my life with. Can you imagine having to deal with a decision like this at your age? What would you have done? He saved him. His lover was saved, and his lover lived 6 more torturous months in excruciating and wretched discomfort and pain before he died. And to this day, Mike has not forgiven himself for not letting his lover die. I guess it's when I hear experiences like this that I get more energy to keep on fighting. More than any statistic, These are the things that hit home. How can life be so cruel? How can we not fight against this? How can we not keep hoping that it will all go away, that a cure will be found, that a government and a president and a country will pay attention? I hope that what I have said has somehow reached a part of you, and that you too will join our fight. Thank you. Please, thank you. Thank you. I don't want that. Thank you very much. There are microphones set up here for any of you who have questions. I want to remind you that your own fellow Oberlin graduate, Peter Staley, here from the class of '83, will be holding a discussion on more specific things that can possibly be done following the question and answer period. Peter Staley, as I've said several times this weekend on this campus, is one of the most courageous men I know. He is best known for helping to get the price of AZT reduced by 20%. And he was able to accomplish this only by the following means. I've told this story before, and I tell it again proudly. The first time, he took several other of ACT UP members and went down to Raleigh-Durham in North Carolina and boarded himself into their headquarters of Burroughs Wellcome, the manufacturer of AZT, and stayed there until the police had to drill him out, and they were taken to jail, and we got media coverage, and our first small reduction in the price of AZT. We do these tactics only when they don't come to the table, when they don't answer the phone. The second thing he did was recently, he and several others chained themselves to the gates of the New York Stock Exchange. Peter is an ex-Wall Streeter when he left Oberlin, and was able to get and forge passes to gain entrance. It's the first time in history that business on the New York Stock Exchange was stopped. And we got our second reduction in the price of AZT. He's the class of '83. He is not much older than you. He too is HIV positive. He too went out into the world expecting a different life. I'm very proud that he is my friend. I can't see very well. Are there people standing in lines to ask me questions?
Hi. I was wondering what you think of the exclusion of the LGBTQ and ACT UP from the list of Oberlin organizations in the prospective view book.
Is that something that's sent out to new students? And, well, that is unacceptable, and the administration must be known that it is unacceptable, and there are ways to let them know that it is unacceptable. And protests, letters, anger. recently, I don't know if you saw it on TV, but I think it was, where did Vito teach? University, Vito Russo, well anyway, a famous, a gay film historian was teaching at University of California at Santa Clara, I guess it was, where they ruled that gay students could not live in the same, gay couples could not live in the same dorms as straight couples. They had to find their own housing. And the whole student body went out on a strike and a protest, and were able to effect a compromise. They got, the gay students got support from the straight students. It's the only way. You do not get more with honey than with vinegar, which I've also said several times this weekend.
Yeah, Larry, the abortion battle is certainly escalating around the country, and one of the things I've not heard mentioned in regards to that is the connection with the number of women who are going to be HIV positive in the next decades to come, who will need to consider that as one of their options in their early pregnancy. And I think those of us who are fighting for reproductive freedoms must include that in our ammunition as well.
It's a very good point. There certainly is a very good point. Thank you.
ACT UP is the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, and coalition is part of that. So I guess I want to ask about coalition building. And as AIDS, as you mentioned, is becoming more and more a disease that affects not just gay men, but affects lots of different communities of color, IV drug users, etc. And also, AIDS is devastating parts of Africa and other parts of the third world. And these, when talking about Africa and the third world, we're talking about places that have been devastated by other health problems because of the way that colonialism and capitalism have affected them and underdeveloped them. And so I want to ask, how we can form coalition with these communities and with people in other countries, and how we as white North Americans, and for those of us who are men, as men, can deal with our own, the way that we benefit from this privilege and from racism, how we can deal with our own racism, our own sexism, our own homophobia, etc., to form coalition and to fight against AIDS.
You've just talked about remaking the world. All of these things are essential, and all of these things are so difficult, and many of them have just been out of our grasp. These are problems that ACT UP in New York faces on a daily basis within our own organization, with our committees that represent minorities and who are angry at us for not doing just the things that you're saying, our own members. I don't know what it is these days about why it's so difficult to form coalitions. I don't know if I'm not enough of an historian to know if it was ever easier at any time in the past. The communities that are affected by AIDS, of course, are communities that are very difficult to organize. People who take drugs are not organized into any kind of community and have very few people speaking for them and are very hard to locate. Hispanic people have completely different notions about AIDS than black people, and both of those are very angry at the white community for perceived wrongs, quite rightly, of racism. There's an enormous amount of distrust. I don't know if you're familiar with what happened recently in New York City, where ACT UP came out against the new health commissioner from Indiana, Dr. Myers, and who was a black man, and the whole thing got turned into a racist issue, and it had nothing to do, we thought, with racism. And the gay community, in fact, was suddenly the whipping boy. And yet, our most successful action recently at St. Patrick's Cathedral was based on a coalition with a women's group, WHAM. It's just very difficult, that's all. We have to keep trying, and I feel that a lot, this is going to sound bad and it's going to all come back against me, but just as I got angry at the gay community, and still do, for more of us not being involved. Their ACT UP may be wonderful, and there may be 3,000 people on our mailing list, but there's still 1 million gay people in New York, so that's a lot of people who aren't doing anything. And that makes me very angry. I get angry at the Black and Hispanic communities for not organizing themselves, for not recognizing. There's got to be a few people in these communities who know what is so awful. And I'm tired in ACT UP of being the whipping boy for not getting these coalitions building. Everybody has got to do it. And even by having said what I've said, I've already caused dissension, and you get an idea of the enormous problems in these coalitions. But something is very wrong with this country right now in terms of turf and people simply not trusting each other anymore. Again, I don't know if they ever did, but it just seems to be rampant now. It's not a very good answer.
I was hoping you would comment on the International Conference on AIDS that supposedly will be happening.
Thank you. That's a good question. The sixth International Conference on AIDS is taking place in San Francisco from June 20th to June 24th, and I hope you will all be there to protest and riot. That's what I think of it. The conference, to call it an international conference is a joke, because this government refuses to allow people into this country who are HIV positive from other countries, so most of the World AIDS organizations are not coming and are boycotting it, needless to say. So a conference that had enrolled 15,000 people in Montreal last year and was to have had 20,000 in San Francisco this year will be very under-attended. I think it is very important that we all be there to do to San Francisco what we did at Montreal last year. We are given very few media opportunities where there is so much media in one place, where we can show our anger and show our dissatisfaction. And this conference is a good place to do it. And if your organization or an organization is boycotting it, that's fine, but it doesn't preclude us as individuals going there and joining picket lines and interrupting meetings and all the things that nice little boys and girls don't usually do. We obtained so many results, positive results from what we did at Montreal last year. I hope you remember the media of that from that. ACT UP and other chapters from New York. Literally, that was the story of last year's conference. We ruled it. We took it over from the opening session. We interrupted, we screamed, we protested, we waved watches back and forth. But at the same time, we passed out a treatment agenda of things that we wanted. And it was a very impressive treatment agenda, and in this past year, we have obtained almost all of the things that we asked for. ACT UP, and we're not very good at blowing our own horns, unfortunately. The world just thinks of us as militant street troops. We have a body of very smart people who are, well, street troops are smart too, and sometimes the negotiators that I'm referring to are the same as the street troops, who are in there negotiating with the government. And ACT UP in the last year has done more and accomplished more than I think all of the gay and AIDS organizations have been able to accomplish in the entire 10 years of this epidemic. We have gotten a good half dozen drugs released. We have shortened the approval time of the Food and Drug Administration from 10 years to 2 years. We've gotten the concept of what's called parallel track or expanded access, where patients will be able to get drugs at the same time that they're being officially tested, approved or about to be approved. DDI, which is not a very good drug, but it is is just as problematic a drug as AZT, but it is enormously useful to people who cannot take AZT. We have gotten that drug out there probably about 4 years earlier than otherwise. Peter's going to tell you later about what we're going to be doing at NIH, and we've been able to revolutionize the FDA, the drug approval process, and we have to now begin to do the same thing with NIH. And you do not get that except by these tactics. GMHC and all of the wonderful AIDS health providing organizations do not get any of these things. You only get these things by pressure, by noise, by going after the system.
You've spoken a lot about how the U.S. government has not been dealing at all well with HIV or with AIDS. You talked about bureaucratic tie-ups and legislative stuff that's gone on, and even told a few stories about PWAs. But you haven't spoken very much at this point about safer sex education, about who's been doing the education, about cultural relevance and sensitivity, and about how educators have gone into communities who's been doing the education. And I was hoping that you could speak a bit about that.
You're absolutely right. I'm very bad on all these issues. I am single-mindedly, obsessively concerned with the cure and with treatment. And that has to do with I want to live, and I want my friends to live, and I want all of you to live. But just from a pragmatic point of view, it just seems to me that when there is a treatment and when there is a cure, that all the other issues are not going to be around. And yes, education is a big problem, and cultural sensitivity is an enormous problem. We have been able to actually act up. That's one of the things I should have patted us on the back for, which, because of our protest at St. Patrick's, which got the worst media in the world but turned out to be the best thing we've ever done, we have been able to, the Catholic Church, in fact, has conceded several very important points about education in the city of New York. But you're right, I am just so concerned about making this government system that's costing all the money that's supposed to be doing the research work. And I apologize. We have some 30 committees that ACT UP in New York, most of which deal with a lot of these issues. I'm just not a very good spokesperson for it. Okay.
Mr. Kramer, you spoke earlier about the need of coalitions between people of color and the gay and lesbian communities. And I think one of the barriers is that, people within, like the white gay community and within the heterosexual people of color community don't realize that people of color are among the, which are disproportionately dying of
Absolutely.
the virus. I was also wondering if you had any recent statistics on, like, the number of HIV cases in major cities or, for that matter, in the nation, and where people of color are.
I don't have them with me, but you're right, they are grotesque and very scary. And it's just so painful to have to say, to add to all our other burdens or all your other burdens, that people of color now have to cope with the same kind of problems and genocide that the gay community has been fighting, was forced to look at earlier. It's just incomprehensible to me, the things that are allowed in this country to go on, and especially in the black community. The availability of guns, the availability of drugs. Anyway, thank you.
I've heard a statistic that women die 6 times faster of AIDS and due to late diagnosis and other factors of not inaccessibility to health care. And working class people and people of color also are often poorly covered in terms of health insurance. Could you speak to the idea that
Oh, it's just awful.
Inextricably linked to the struggle to fight against it?
Well, Peter says that the 6 times faster for women is true. Yeah.
Yeah, ACT UP has been trying to work really hard on these issues. The sexism and racism involved with AIDS is as bad as the homophobia now. He asked for a statistic on people of color. People of color are now a majority of those infected with HIV in New York. The committee that we have in ACT UP New York that works on this, on gathering those statistics and fighting those issues, calls themselves the Majority Actions Committee. Most of them are IV drug users, but it's also black men, people of color, gay men that are black with AIDS. As far as the issues with women, we've had a terrible problem of the government research effort excluding women from almost all of their trials. A shocking statistic is that on AZT, Burroughs Wellcome to date, after it was given marketing approval in '87 and the drug has been studied to death, to date, Burroughs Wellcome has studied AZT on more female rats than they have on female humans. And they discovered just this year, finally, that AZT causes cancer in female rats, where it doesn't occur in male rats. This is shocking to find out so late in the game, and the reason we found it out so late in the game is they never bothered to test AZT on women. And this is across the board with all drugs, and it's a major crime. These drugs act differently in different groups of people, and they have to be tested in all groups from the start. And it's something we're working really hard on, and we're trying to get NIH to take seriously, but we'll need you to join that fight.
Go ahead.
Mr. Kramer, Mr. Staley, you mentioned in your speech how certain minorities have received legitimacy to the point where, for instance, it simply isn't legal, it simply isn't acceptable to discriminate against, say, blacks or Hispanics or Jews. Though this still goes on, still overt discrimination.
Oh, no question.
And as you pointed out, that is not really true of the gay community. You still have widespread discrimination, often under the law. What do you see can be done to affect the pervasiveness of attitudes towards gays and in changing people's opinions and in changing those laws that seem to have so much to do with how gays and how the AIDS crisis is viewed?
Oh, I mean, these are such broad and general questions. I've been very moved being here at Oberlin, seeing such interaction between gay and straight kids, and that there are so many of you here tonight. And I can only imagine that many of you are both straight and gay. So this is in marked distinction from my own years, as I mentioned earlier, at Yale. And so there is progress made in all of this. You know, what can be done is that we have every day is a fight. Every day is a fight too. And it depends how strong you are and how angry you are and how willing you are to go against the tide. I was witness to several incidences of homophobia in the last couple of days that I've been here, and I was thrilled to watch both gay and straight kids deal with it and attend to it and not let it pass and call to task the offenders. And that's what you have to do, is that we simply must not let anything pass. Peter has a very good point about ACT UP having changed what the world thinks of gay people. We're fighters. They didn't think we were fighters. They thought we were people who you could kick indefinitely. And we've shown them that we're not. And I think it surprised an awful lot of people. And that's basically what we have to do about everything.
Mr. Kramer, in response to your call for action and rendering a voice, in response to the fact that the LGBTQ has been left out of the view book, I would like to remind and inform people here, and also again welcome you and Peter Staley to join us in the March Against Bigotry, which begins tonight in Wilder Bowl, 11 o'clock p.m., which is designed to address that issue, and also issues which are not dealt with or responded to by the administration, such as the fact that people of color are harassed by death threats over the phone, and there's no response. That there are 10-year-old federal policies which have to make the school accessible for differently abled people, and that our school is, again, as usual, behind on that. And several other issues. So I hope that people do come out and do exercise our urging and often complicity that we express in classes to act and vocalize where we stand on these issues tonight.
There you go. Last question here.
Okay, I don't know if I have the right person, but I think it was Louis Farrakhan who has suggested that the United States government actually introduced the HIV virus into black communities in ghettos. Purpose I was wondering if you know anything about that, what your view of that?
It's the one question that comes up every single time I speak. And, I don't know that we're ever going to know where this comes from, this virus. Not to drop a few names, but Lily Tomlin sent me 6 tapes that she got from, it's not Voice of America, but it sounds like that. It's a San Francisco program, radio program that deals with social issues over a long time, sort of like Pacifica or something. And we're talking about 6 tapes double-sided, so what is that, like 12 hours? And I've been plowing my way through it. And it's all about various paranoid scenarios, and there have been many. And since the very beginning. And when you start listening to tape 1, you say, yeah. And by the time you get to the end of the last tape, it's all so clear that this was the biggest perpetrated, intentional germ warfare introduction that the world has ever known, because the accretion of all the minutiae with the government study of germ warfare, and they trace it all from the Second World War. And there was a place in Britain called Porton Down, and there's a place in Washington called Fort Detrick, and Fort Detrick is in fact run by the National Cancer Institute, but it's funded by Litton Industries, and Litton Industries was connected to Howard Hughes, and it just goes on and on and on. And who the hell knows? I mean, at this point, nothing would surprise me. But a lot of the early scenarios have been ruled out by data. I mean, it's green monkeys and Haiti and gay tourists in Haiti and things like that have just been ruled out by an accumulation more of data. But there doesn't seem to be anything yet. But I mean, I'm not going to be the one to say I don't believe it couldn't have happened. Is there more? I can't see. No? 2 more. Okay.
I just wanted to ask a quick question about terminology. You mentioned that 25 million homosexual people cannot be considered abnormal by any means, and yet you used the word straight several times referring to heterosexuals. I was wondering if you could address that.
I don't understand the question.
Straight can be sometimes seen as another word for normal.
Oh, got it.
You referred to heterosexuals as normal.
I'm sorry, I apologize. Sorry.
I think a lot of people here tonight are going to want to do a lot of different things, not just one thing about fighting against AIDS. One thing I want to do, and I would imagine that other people do too, is make a contribution to ACT UP. Can you tell us how to do that most immediately and effectively?
Yes, definitely. I was head of fundraising for ACT UP for 3 years until December. And I'm proud to say that we've built ourselves in, if you consider ACT UP a gay and lesbian organization, we're now the largest in the country, beating NGLTF and the others. NGLTF being the second largest. You just make out a check to ACT UP and you can give it to me here, or you can, if you have pens handy, you can mail it to ACT UP 496A Hudson Street, Suite G4, New York, New York 10014. And the great thing about your contribution is that we're the only AIDS organization in the country where that won't go into anybody's pocket. We don't pay any salaries. We're a 100% volunteer organization, and that's why we're so burnt out. And one other thing all of you in this room could do kind of instantaneously is get Oberlin College a little accountable on this issue. I personally want to know where the fuck Fred Starr is tonight. I just thank God he wasn't my president when I was here. But my class seemed to manage to bump off Dannenberg. Maybe you could bump off Fred Starr somehow.
In addition to those two boroughs welcome demonstrations I told you, Peter has been in charge of fundraising and has literally raised for ACT UP and over the last year $750,000. Which we have spent to, which we have just about all spent getting you these drugs and maintaining a Xerox machine, which is a human maw. Last question.
Just one last question. I was just kind of concerned a little bit about how the role kind of lesbians play in ACT UP. You talked a lot about the history of scientific racism and how this country is founded on keeping a group of people poor and sick so that they can sort of do the workforce cheaply. But you haven't kind of included in your analysis, lesbians. If you look at science and medicine, lesbians are totally not there. Dental dams are a joke. I'm sorry. I just can't handle that. So.
Dental dams are a joke.
Kind of either of you can speak to that if, lesbians.
I can't handle dental dams either.
No comment from me.
Lesbians are really have been the backbone of ACT UP. They came in very early on. Most of the gay men in ACT UP were my age. They were very young, inexperienced at activism altogether, and very early on we were joined by a group of lesbians who were older and had experience in the abortion movement, the pro-life movement, pro-choice movement, and whoops, and also had a lot of experience. Some of them were old enough to have a lot of experience in the anti-war movement in the 60s. And they taught the rest of us how to do what we're doing today. And we've modified it quite a bit because civil disobedience is much harder today. Simple demonstrations on the streets going around in circles used to get media attention. Today they don't. You have to up the ante. So we've done a lot of modifying, but they were our teachers and they were our stabilizers when we were still are when we have a lot of internal fighting, which any organization goes through. They've managed to keep hotheads like myself on an even keel.
Okay, let's all go over to Wilder and hear Peter. Thank you.